So, for our first lecture, I want to take you back to where our country begins, which is our colonial period. And I think it's important to start with history because history is where the story begins. And so, when we look at the American story, it begins really in this colonial period. We can divide American history into two distinct parts. And the first is our colonial period. We begin 1620 with the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock, and the colonial period ends with the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War. Now, if you take a step back, you question why 1620? Why is that our beginning? Why not 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue? Or even the question of why are we taking the perspective of the Pilgrims who arrive? Why not the Native Americans who are standing on the shore watching invading hordes come to their country in boats to colonize? And so that perspective of whose history are we looking at is crucial to analyze and to critically think about as you're going through history. And we are going to start with the Pilgrims because that's our through story. Those are the characters that we identify with. But I want you to realize that we could start it from a variety of perspectives and timelines. This is what's traditionally taught. And the colonial period is clearly not our favorite period of history. We rush through it in history classes, and most of us don't know a whole lot about the colonial period. You sort of get that condensed version where it seems like it's all happening in a generation or two. And so what I want to emphasize with this timeline is that it's a very long time. It's generation after generation after generation after generation after generation after generation. And that the Pilgrims who land in 1620 are not alive at the Revolution. And that the revolutionaries, those who decide to declare their independence, have been Americans or Englishmen abroad. That self-concept of being in the New World for generation after generation. And, when you look at your own family's history of when your immigrant story began, for me, my great-grandfather arrived in 1903 from Italy, and that's a shorter period of time than some of these colonials had been here. You're looking at a Revolutionary War figure whose ancestors arrived in 1620. They had been here longer than my own family today. So that perspective of time, I think, is crucial to understand. But we do condense this. And then I'm not going to be any different. I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on this, except that I want you to put yourself in the mindset. Think like a colonial person, whoever that figure might be. It might be that you're a businessman and a merchant, or a farmer, or a soldier, or a young woman looking to marry well, or a young man to go off to college and make a better life. That idea of breaking away from England was really difficult because of that long history. And I want you to keep that in mind as we move along with this question of, would you have supported the revolution? We know, of course, that it works out well and we win, but standing on this side of the timeline looking forward, we don't know what's going to happen, and the odds seem pretty insurmountable. So that's what I want you to keep in mind. Now, after the revolution, that's when our story really begins. That's when we celebrate the birthday of our country as 1776 on July 4th, and the fireworks and the celebration, because that's when we become truly American. That's when our story of independence begins. And we don't particularly like the other side of the timeline when we're subjects to the crown and we are not our own governors. So this period of history is what we spend a lot of time studying, and we'll be talking about throughout our class. So I want you to put yourself in the mind of a colonist. Maybe you live in New York, or maybe you live in Virginia, maybe down in Georgia as a plantation owner, or North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, maybe all the way up in the New England states. Remember, this is 1700s, so travel is difficult. It's by foot or by horse. Most colonists don't travel very far in their entire life. Most will live and die within about 15 miles of their birthplace. So lots of us in Southern California travel more in a day than colonists did their whole life. Your whole family has been there. Your community is there. And for most of this time, most of this 156 years, we've been in a peaceful relationship with England. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. There's economic gain on both sides. If you are a merchant, you've done very well importing goods from England and selling them to fellow colonists. If you are a farmer, you've done very well with exporting raw materials to our trading partners in Europe. So the idea of war is going to be difficult. We're going to upend the safe life. We're going to risk economic ruin. Many will go bankrupt. So it's a difficult decision, and it's not one that's made lightly. The events leading up to the American Revolution include war, which is incredibly expensive. It drains the treasury of England, and so things started to change. We needed more money, and so taxes were enacted. But almost before that, there comes a psychological change where we start to distrust England, and England starts to just distrust us, and we don't like their rules, and they don't like our rebellion. And there's very much an us versus them mentality that becomes prevalent. The colonists grow to resent England. England grows to resent us. And there's a back and forth that exists for a couple of decades where things are really starting to change. That psychological break of us versus them is really the most important. It's difficult to get a people to go to war against themselves. And so that division, that divide of they are different, they don't think like us, they don't act like us, they are worthy of a fight, is really crucial before revolution. And we start to see that among many of the colonists. Parliament passes a Stamp Act, and basically the Stamp Act is a tax that the colonists believed violated their rights, and so we protested. And the Stamp Act was repealed. Parliament was actually, pretty willing to compromise with us. And so they did repeal it. They then pass another act that we don't like, that French and Indian War that was happening in North America. The French and Indians on our western border were fighting against the English, and particularly among the frontier on the western side of our colonies. And so England needed to put troops in our colonies to protect us during the war and to protect those borders. And so one of the problems is that the soldiers need a place to live. The soldiers need barracks. We didn't want to pay for taxes. And so Parliament passes the Quartering Act, which says that colonists will house soldiers in their homes and provide food. And in big cities, it might be, soldiers at the church or the town meeting hall. But on the frontier, there aren't a lot of those extra buildings. There aren't a lot of municipal or town buildings. So it ended up being in colonist homes. And if you think about what our reaction today would be, to a budget cut that closed down Pendleton, and now we're all individual families taking troops into our homes, and what that would mean, that violation of privacy, being told what to do. We really think of our homes as these private kingdoms for our families, and to have a soldier be placed in your home without you volunteering would be a tremendous violation of those ideas. So support for the revolution is starting to build. Not everyone supports it, but certainly more and more people are starting to think that we need to break away from England. There's a lot of loyalists who, sort of say, listen, we've worked things out for 150 years. We can survive this king that is difficult, and we need to compromise. And there's also the practical side of things, which I think I would have been a loyalist because I would have been so scared of the changes, of what would happen to my business, what would happen to my family, what would happen to my husband or my children, what would happen to our way of life if war were to be declared. And the reality is that we're a ragtag group of colonies that don't have much in common. There's the very real possibility that we would lose a war against one of the two giant superpowers of the world, England and France being the two superpowers of the day. But there were enough revolutionaries who wanted to break away that started to gain some support. And Common Sense is a pamphlet that was written, an essay that was written by Thomas Paine. And that starts to persuade people to talk about revolution. It's a treasonable offense. This is a big deal just to talk about, let alone acting upon it or raising money for it or rallying troops. But Common Sense did start the debate among the colonists about revolution. And so we have this discussion among the colonies and among the people and among families and after town hall meetings. And people start to agree that they want a revolution. And so our Continental Congress meets and writes the Declaration of Independence, assigns it to Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson plagiarizes wildly from philosopher John Locke the idea of natural rights, the idea of rights that are endowed in each of us, not being taken away. And the Declaration of Independence is really two documents. The first is the non-negotiable cause of the American Revolution, the very foundation of our country, which is included in paragraph 2. And then the rest, if you read the Declaration of Independence, it's this huge laundry list of grievances against England, the King, and Parliament. But the non-negotiable cause, when you really look at it, is this paragraph here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, when we send this to King George, there is no way he can accept it. He believes in divine right, the idea that he was chosen by God and is the king that rules over his subjects. And we declare in this document that that is not true. We say, we were chosen by God, endowed with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that cannot be taken away by governments, because governments are instituted among men. And they get their power not from God, but from the consent of the governed. And that is non negotiable.